Tonight, dozens of residents evacuated from Victoria's worst-hit aged care homes as 9 more Victorians die from COVID-19. Also tonight, billion-dollar blowout. The Territory Government blames the COVID crisis for its dire financial situation. Plans to establish a US military fuel reserve in Darwin amid rising tensions with China. And out of this world, Virgin Galactic about to start test flights of its spacecraft. Good evening, Eleni Roussos with ABC News. It's been another deadly day in Victoria's fight against coronavirus. 9 people have lost their lives. 7 of them were in aged care. The overall number of new cases in that state has fallen again, dropping to 295, but it's the aged care sector that's struggling to cope with the spread of the virus. Richard Willingham reports.
Jim Stafiri is dealing with the news that nobody with a loved one in aged care wants to hear. His mother, Louisa, has tested positive to COVID.
Things haven't been good for days, so she just needs to be taken out of here, taken to the hospital to give her the best chance.
His mother and others at Epping Gardens have been transferred to hospital after 2 people died and 83 cases were confirmed. Other homes being evacuated include St Basil's in Fawkner, where there have been 92 cases and 11 deaths, Kirkbrae in Kilsyth with 73 cases and 1 death, and Outlook Gardens in Dandenong North with 35 cases. Helen Anderson's mum has been removed from Outlook Gardens. She's relieved help has arrived.
I hope that no other families have to go through what the agony that we've had to go through.
We are all very distressed by those events that took place in those few facilities.
Most of the 800 aged care cases are in privately run centres regulated by the Commonwealth. There had been plenty of warning about the risks.
It is not unpredictable that, in fact, the infections have happened in the aged care homes.
Emergency doctor Sarah Whitelaw says authorities should have used the past 5 months to prepare a proper response.
There will be a point in the not too distant future where we run out of capacity. We will run out of beds.
So many staff were infected at St Basil's that some residents were left to fend for themselves.
This was a new situation that had not been anticipated or foreshadowed.
Due to their condition, some of the elderly in hospital won't be in intensive care.
It's very tragic that it's gotten to a point where they are infected with coronavirus and they're requiring end-of-life care, but it's a tragic reality.
Simmering tension had threatened to boil over, with the blame game and background briefing in full swing. But to combat this unprecedented situation, unity is required. And while the Prime Minister may have referred to this as a Victorian wave, the focus is rightly on working together to stop the spread.
I think it's a bit of a storm in a teacup.
The only fight I'm engaged in is a fight against this deadly virus, and that will not change.
A reminder of the effort needed to stop this virus from spreading and taking lives. Richard Willingham, ABC News, Melbourne.
In Brisbane, 2 women are facing criminal charges after testing positive to coronavirus. They travelled from Melbourne and failed to self-isolate. A third woman, a close contact of the other 2, tested positive late this afternoon.
The queue for urgent coronavirus testing grows outside a Logan school shut down after a cleaner tested positive. The woman is one of 2 19-year-olds infected after returning from Victoria, a banned COVID hotspot.
I'm very, very disappointed. I think it was reckless.
I'm absolutely furious that this has happened.
The pair took Virgin flights from Melbourne to Sydney, then Brisbane on the 21st of July. Then, for 8 days, wandered the community while symptomatic, instead of going into quarantine. How they got through Queensland's closed border is now under criminal investigation.
The initial investigations indicate that there are incorrect details on border declaration passes. The investigation will look at whether that was deliberate or otherwise.
The pair faces fines of thousands of dollars and up to 6 months in jail. But authorities say the more urgent concern is containing any spread in the Logan and Springfield communities. Late this afternoon, a third woman tested positive. The 22-year-old is a close contact of the pair and worked at the Chatswood Hills Primary School. That facility has also now been closed and contact tracing is underway.
As a result of that, a lot of people are going to be inconvenienced, and I do apologise to those people for what is now going to have to occur.
As a further precaution, aged care homes in the Metro South region will be put into lockdown for at least 48 hours. Visitors will be banned and staff unable to work across multiple facilities.
Just in case one of them's come into contact with someone who then goes to an aged care facility.
These are Queensland's first locally acquired cases in about 2 months, and it's still unknown where the illness was contracted. But growing clusters in southern states has forced the Premier to again tighten border restrictions, now shutting out all of Greater Sydney.
That will now become a COVID-declared hotspot, taking effect from 1 a.m. on Saturday morning.
The declaration stretches from the city through the outer suburbs to the Blue Mountains and north to the Central Coast, banning millions of people from entering the Sunshine State. Any Queenslanders there now have just days to get home or be forced into hotel quarantine. Alison Horn, ABC News, Brisbane.
The next couple of days could be critical for Queensland as it tries to track down any new cases spread by the women who dodged quarantine. Here's our analyst, Casey Briggs.
3 different states in 3 different phases of this pandemic. Just 3 new cases today in Queensland, but they represent the single biggest challenge this state's faced in several months in this pandemic. With quick action taken to shut down potentially exposed sites, the state's hoping to end community transmission before it takes hold. If it's too late, well then Queensland might start to look like New South Wales, where the average number of locally acquired cases is currently hovering just under a dozen each day. But there are still very few cases that can't be traced back to known outbreaks, less than 2 every day. When Victoria was seeing these sorts of overall case numbers, it was recording more cases than that it couldn't find the source for. So New South Wales is clearly more successfully holding the line at this point in the pandemic, at least for now. If these numbers do start to creep up, well then Sydney's at greater risk of becoming more like this. The good thing is we are seeing some smaller numbers out of Melbourne at the moment, not enough to definitively say the trend is on the way down, but a step in the right direction. And with clusters continuing to grow across Melbourne, Victoria's Chief Health Officer says unknown source infections are remaining stable at the moment. At this point, 3 weeks into the citywide lockdown, you'd hope they'd actually be starting to go down.
The COVID crisis has walloped the economy in another extraordinary way. Australia has entered a period of deflation after the biggest quarterly fall in prices for 72 years. Here's finance correspondent Philip Lasker.
What's happening now?
It's a story you don't often hear. Free childcare from the government.
And that saw the very large drag on CPI for the quarter and was really the key driver.
Prices collapsed nearly 2% in the June quarter, the biggest quarterly CPI fall ever. It meant Australia has recorded an annual deflation rate, a very rare event. Adding to the huge moves in childcare were petrol prices and preschool provided free in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. Rents also recorded the biggest fall since at least 1972. Hobart real estate agent Robbie Yoland has felt the impact as the tourism and hospitality industries shut down and borders closed.
Certainly the lack of international students has had quite a drastic impact.
On the other hand, prices associated with staying at home, like household goods and furniture, went up. Since the Great Depression, deflation has only happened 2 other times, during a recession in the 60s and during the Asian financial crisis in 1997 as the cost of imports dropped and commodity prices collapsed. But this drop has been swifter. Prolonged deflation can be dangerous because it doesn't help reduce debt People may hold off spending, expecting cheaper prices, and confidence may suffer because people feel less well off.
This is more likely to be a one-off instance of deflation rather than something we can expect to see repeated for a couple of quarters or more.
But inflation will remain low.
What we worry about is a very weak economy and uncertain recovery, a huge amount of slack in the labour market.
That means fewer clients for people like Robbie. Philip Lasker, ABC News.
The Northern Territory government is blaming coronavirus for its net debt, which is expected to blow out to more than $8 billion by the end of this financial year. The projection is about $1.3 billion higher than pre-COVID estimates and is part of a budget update released today for voters to scrutinise before the August election.
The Territory's budget blowout is a bitter pill to swallow, but there wasn't a way out of this, according to the government.
This is the cost of corona. This is the hit, and it's a big hit. If our opponents do not like the decisions we have made, that's totally fine. But it's also their duty to say what they would do differently.
Our mid-year report and March quarterly report showed an improved budget position. But COVID-19 has changed everything.
The government removed the legal requirement to give voters a pre-election fiscal update when the pandemic began. Instead, they've got a smaller document without the same detail, but it does show the Territory's net debt is now expected to be $8.2 billion this financial year, a jump of about $1.3 billion. The deficit will be sitting at minus $2.3 billion, which is also a $1.3 billion hit. And the Territory's GST share will drop by $649 million over 2 years, which some observers say is overly optimistic because of optimistic federal figures.
I would be very surprised if it's less than, say, 800 to 900 million.
The government's also pointing to its $382 million spend on coronavirus. Mining royalties, which make up the largest part of the Territory's own source revenue, are also expected to create a $100 million hole. That's something the opposition says it could assist with.
By simplifying mining tax, we can hopefully secure those 13 mines who are sitting there right now waiting to make a decision about whether or not they invest here in the Territory.
Some say it's not quite right for the government to claim credit for the past financial year's fiscal position.
Because it's related timing of spending, and some of that may well be activities that had to be delayed because of COVID-19.
The coronavirus is a great excuse for all governments, in the sense that they can abandon tight controls over expenditure and blame it all on the virus, which to a huge degree that's the case.
The government says savings measures to fix its budget crisis before the pandemic hit, like executive pay freezes, are continuing. But the idea of further cuts is not a popular topic.
But if you're looking for cuts to the public service, if you're looking for hikes to power prices, you've come to the wrong leader in the wrong party.
In the Northern Territory, 600 senior executive positions. If you were simply to reduce that by, say, 20, you could increase, that would return you about $40 million.
But is this something Territory Alliance thinks it can commit to?
It's not a time for cuts and those kinds of responses. I think we're looking at a 20-year time frame here.
And what should voters who want to scrutinise the government's performance do?
Remain confused.
All parties say they'll put forward their election commitments during the campaign period to Treasury for costings, which should be made public in time for the election. Felicity James, ABC News.
Just weeks out from the election, the Northern Territory's 4 Indigenous land councils have banded together and come out with a list of demands for whoever wins government. They're calling for a new Aboriginal-controlled system to run remote housing and say they want to see safer drinking water and stronger border controls for all bush communities.
In a show of solidarity, the Territory's 4 Indigenous land councils meet in Darwin with a message.
We're calling on Gunner to want an urgent reform of housing system in our communities, homeland and town camps, and we are united by it.
The land councils, which represent all of the NT's Aboriginal-owned land, say both the Territory and federal governments have failed at delivering housing for the bush and want to see a new system to see all aspects of remote housing, from their design and construction to maintenance, in Aboriginal hands.
We want control of all housing in our remote communities.
I mean, let's not wait for the government. Let's build the houses.
They say the Gunner government's hallmark remote housing scheme, the $1.1 billion 10-year Room to Breathe program to build extensions onto existing houses, is failing badly.
It's not working, should be scrapped, and we want to have under control with our new housing authority.
It comes on the back of an NT Auditor General's report which found systemic problems with the program's delivery. But the call for full control has been knocked back by the NT government with a concession.
I've said no to that in the past. What I have said is I want to do community housing and transition Territory government housing stock across to community control.
The land councils say it's not enough to hand the houses over. They want control of how many are being built and where. And they had a blunt warning from Bush voters to the government.
It was very simple. If things are not being improved in the communities, there'll be a second chance.
They've also called for all major parties to detail how they'll better safeguard the drinking water in remote communities and for stronger border measures to be enforced during the pandemic. Matt Garrick, ABC News.
Police in Tennant Creek have identified 3 young people in relation to a recent spate of suspicious fires in the town. Police are speaking to 2 girls aged 12 and 13 over a fire which caused significant damage to the town's supermarket earlier this month. They're also investigating the involvement of an 11-year-old boy. The supermarket fire left the Tennant Creek community without a permanent grocery store. Police say the trio could be connected to other suspicious fires in the town. A 37-year-old man has died at a construction site in Katherine. NT WorkSafe says the worker reportedly fell from the tracks of an excavator around 7:30 this morning. Both NT WorkSafe and Northern Territory Police are investigating the circumstances of the death. Still to come this hour, the Olympians with Tokyo 2021 in their sights.
The delaying of the Games for a year has massive psychological impact.
When it happened, it was just like, now what? So you felt a little bit lost, just as in, all the build-up, all the hype around it.
Once, the dust has settled and make a plan and things like that.
Also, we reveal the contract that sheds new light on Victoria's hotel quarantine debacle. That's coming.
They're the closest of allies, but Australia and the United States have struck different tones on how to deal with Beijing's growing influence. The foreign and defence ministers are tonight returning home from Washington after signing a new top-secret military deal. Here's Defence correspondent Andrew Green.
In an era of social distancing, they're getting ever closer.
The United States stands with you in our unbreakable alliance.
Australia and the United States' strong and enduring relationship is built on our shared values.
These days, whenever they meet, one topic dominates.
It is unacceptable for Beijing to use exports or student fees as a cudgel against Australia.
China's behaviour across the Indo-Pacific condemned as malign activity. From the high seas to the streets of Hong Kong. And in the world of cyber warfare, Australia was praised by its hosts for holding the line.
Despite intense, continued, coercive pressure from the Chinese Communist Party to bow to Beijing's wishes.
An expansion of war games off Australia's north coast was discussed. Soon other strategic partners could be invited. And the Trump administration is still pushing for more aggressive freedom of navigation exercises in the disputed South China Sea.
We will fly, we will sell, and we will operate wherever international law allows.
The guests, wary of economic consequences, politely declined.
Recently, the relationship that we have with China is important, and we have no intention of injuring it.
Already strained Chinese relations could again be tested by a new joint declaration reaffirming unofficial ties with Taiwan. The Allies also signed a secret plan to coordinate military deployments while agreeing to new strategic assets in the top end.
We intend to establish a US-funded commercially operated strategic military fuel reserve in Darwin.
The first ministers to leave Australia during the COVID pandemic have walked a fine line with their allies, issuing strong statements against China while also resisting pressure to further muscle up to Beijing. And they've done so acutely aware that the United States is now well into presidential election season. But face-to-face meetings have their downsides.
This mask and glasses thing is driving me insane.
Now these two homeward-bound Aussies are preparing for 2 weeks of mandatory quarantine. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
The decision to establish a US military fuel storage reserve in Darwin is a sign of Australia's strategic weakness. That's the view of a defence analyst who says the top end's pivotal location is slowly being recognised by military leaders around the region. But the announcement has been embraced by a Chief Minister who's eager for more US and Australian troops to be based in the top end.
A strategic move to build a storage facility at least 4 times the size of Darwin's Vopak terminal. That's the prediction of a security analyst who's pointed to Australia's inability to fuel the US or its own military in a crisis.
The Americans who want to operate from Northern Australia have had to say they're going to invest in local infrastructure to fix a problem that is an Australian sovereign problem.
He says 4 decades of white paper recommendations to increase Australia's military numbers in the north have not been matched by actions.
Everyone agrees that Northern Australia is important. They just haven't been able to articulate how to do that development better, and there's been a lot of policy failures in that sense.
It's a sore point for the Chief Minister, who's pressing the Prime Minister to turn around a decade-long decline in Australian troops in the top end.
We should review where our forces are postured in Australia. I don't think they should be in Adelaide, for example, defending against penguins. They should be in Darwin.
He's highlighted AUSMIN's discussion of an increased US Marine presence and plans to expand dry season exercises to the wet, and spoken to the Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds, about job prospects for locals from the fuel reserve.
The best phrase that she gave me permission to use was it'll be thumpingly large.
He's cagey about where the facility will be built, but the current port, leased by Chinese company Landbridge, is extremely unlikely.
Darwin Harbour is obviously very large. There's many things we could do in the Darwin Harbour versus what we might do on the specific port land that the current person who leases the port does.
They've also given no sign that Glide Point or Gun Point are in their sights for fuel storage or a deep water military port. Rick Hind, ABC News, Darwin.
Our China correspondent Bill Birtles has just been at a briefing by the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing. Bill, Australia's walking a fine line here. What's been China's response to the AUSMIN talks and the manoeuvring around Hong Kong?
Eleni, China's government was paying close attention to that ministerial visit to Washington, particularly anything these days that involves US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It always elicits a very strong response here. Now, I asked the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin, what did he make of this commitment to increase US-Australian military cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region, and he took a pretty dim view of it.
For quite some time, the US and Australia have been hyping up the so-called China threat, smearing and slandering China on a series of issues. China deplores that and firmly opposes that.
Now, Eleni, it must be said, this sort of language from China's government now is completely boilerplate. You hear it all the time, and it just shows how normalised this sort of confrontational foreign policy has become. There is one other issue. Yesterday, China moved to suspend police cooperation between Australia and authorities in Hong Kong. This was retaliation for Australia earlier scrapping an extradition treaty with that city after Beijing imposed a sweeping new national security law. The big question is, the Australian Federal Police, they have an office in Hong Kong. Will they be able to continue operating there after this move? We put that question to them, but so far they're remaining tight-lipped. Eleni?
Thank you, Bill. The Australian dollar was unmoved by today's well-anticipated drop in consumer prices and ended the day slightly higher. Here's Alan Kohler.
The big fall in the headline CPI in the June quarter was due to one-off factors and is expected to rebound next quarter. But the number that the Reserve Bank watches is the trimmed mean, and that is not expected to rebound for years, which means no change in interest rates for years as well. So let's talk about the trimmed mean. What they do is lay out all 87 components of the Consumer Price Index, biggest fall to biggest rise, like this, and then they trim the ends off, leaving 70% of the items in the middle. And finally, they take the mean or average of those. Why? Well, because the biggest changes are usually temporary, like childcare at the end there. And they want to see the longer lasting or underlying rate of inflation. Now, in the June quarter, that was minus 0.1%, annual rate 1.2%, way below the RBA's target of 2% and below what the punditry were punditing. Nevertheless, the dollar kept calm and carried on. The gold price did make it to Yazga's farm for Woodstock, 1969, but the oil, iron ore and coal prices fell. So resources stocks dragged down the All Ordinaries Index, offset to some extent by gains among the banks. And that fall followed on from Wall Street last night and Tokyo today. Now, last but not least, here's a chart of where mortgage relief is coming from. 24% from those $750 one-off payments, 22% JobKeeper, 15% JobSeeker, 11% from Super Early Release, 8% from the bank repayment deferrals. Now, all those are temporary. But I think the most important bar is the orange one. None of the above. 45%. It means 55% of all people with a mortgage are getting some form of relief. That is amazing. And that's finance.
Australian actors Cate Blanchett and Hugh Jackman are among several Australians nominated for an Emmy this year. The awards recognise excellence in the television industry, with Blanchett vying for Best Lead Actress for her role in Mrs. America. Jackman is in the running for Best Actor in a Limited Series for Bad Education. Toni Collette and Sarah Snook have also been nominated. Dystopian superhero series Watchmen is expected to dominate the Emmys with 26 nominations. Virgin Galactic is about to start powered test flights of its spacecraft, the last hurdle before commercial flights can commence. The company has also revealed the interior of its Unity space plane that will ferry passengers to the edge of space. The cabin design has 12 windows and a huge mirror to enhance the view, while the seating is designed to allow travellers to experience weightlessness on the flights.
We are in the stage where we're putting the finishing touches on our entire customer experience.
600 people have so far paid deposits to take a ride on Unity at $350,000 each. The date for the first flights is yet to be set. Time for the weather now, and tonight's pic taken in Darwin Harbour was sent in by Daryl Brown. It was a cold start to the day across the Territory, with Darwin and Katherine experiencing their coldest mornings so far this year. It got down to 16 degrees in Darwin this morning, 6 in the rural area and 15 the low on the Tiwis. Across the Territory, the mercury plummeted over inland parts, dipping to 9 degrees in Katherine, frosty in the centre with a low of just 1 in Alice Springs. Around Australia today, cloud dominated the southeast, topping 16 degrees in Canberra and Melbourne, a sunny 23 in Brisbane. On the satellite, clear, dry season skies across northern Australia, and there's still plenty of cloud wrapped around a low in the Tasman Sea. Another high pressure system will cross the Bight tomorrow, and that will direct dry and gusty southeasterlies across the Territory. Interstate tomorrow, a frosty start for Canberra. It should be fine in Adelaide, and a cloudy day for Sydney, 18. To our north, storms again for Singapore and Bangkok, a sunny day for Dili and rain for Port Moresby. Back home, Alice Springs, you're getting down to 3 degrees tonight, 12 tonight in Tennant Creek. Up north, cold again in Katherine with a low of 7 tonight, getting down to 14 in Maningrida and 13 in Anuragu. Darwin's in for a cool night again with a low of 17, 16 for Wadeye and 13 in Bachelor. A wind warning remains in place for coastal waters and it now covers the Arafura coast. The fire danger will be severe in Darwin and Adelaide River as those southeasterlies push through tomorrow. There'll be a low tide at 7:40 in the morning and the high will be just after 1 p.m. Sunrise will be at 7:05 and sunset will be at 6:40. And looking ahead for Darwin, nights will be cool, days will be dry and windy through to the weekend. In Alice Springs, cold and frosty nights and days will be mild and sunny for the rest of the week. And to stay up to date with the latest news from the Northern Territory, head to our website, news.abc.net.au. Stay with us now. Lee Sales is up next with 7:30.